Hello, my name is Robert Melser. We're filming from the Pro-Liberty Forum. My guest today, again, is Dr. Tom Giordano. We're talking about the book UnaLIENable, what it really means and why it matters. This is the fourth in a series of interviews. We're going to talk about Tom's dad, Mario, otherwise known as Buster. He had certain views about government's role, and we'll call it Buster's basics, for lack of a better word. Dr. Tom, Buster was a big fan of St Thomas Aquinas. And I'd like you to go into a little bit about the philosophy there and how it impacted your life, and also how it impacted our framers when they were founding our government.
Okay. Well, St. Thomas Aquinas was the person most responsible for introducing the Aristotelian school of thought into the Catholic doctrine. Now, St. Thomas was, I guess you could say, he wanted to provide the pillars of rational thought to prove the God the Creator, rather than having it on faith. So he came up with 5 pillars that basically proved the existence of God the Creator. And basically they were based upon a prime mover, or an efficient cause, setting everything in motion, which would have been the very primal activation of everything that came after it. In other words, it was a prime cause that would create an effect, which would create other causes, or which would be the cause of further effects all the way down. And this was the basis of natural law, cosmic law, and basically our role where we fit in the universe.
Now, Tom, be careful. You're talking about God here.
Yeah,
and
well,
this could get you kicked off of certain media.
well,
But I want to ask you, where is the logic that proves that God exists, and why were the founders so sure of it?
well, if you understand that even though they may not have been looking directly at St. Thomas, the idea of natural law and the causation of a prime mover. Look, if we were to look at the Big Bang Theory, okay? Big Bang Theory is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. There's a theory that there was a big explosion from one minute to the next. Boom. Did you know that that theory was invented or ideated by a Catholic priest, Father Lemaitre in France?
No, I was raised in a Catholic household, and I went to Catholic school, and I've been afraid of priests ever since.
I've been
No,
more afraid of
honestly,
nuns.
I didn't know that a Catholic priest brought that theory into play.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a French priest, Father Lemaitre. And second, I want to know is what was on the mind of God when he made the Big Bang, before it happened.
Speaking of God, interestingly enough, many of the famous astronomers and theorists that have come before us believed in God as well.
Oh, absolutely. You know, the Royal Society in England, I think in the last, 2 centuries ago, I think, in the last century, looked at the 300 most influential scientific minds over the last 2,000 years, and 1 in 5 were Jesuits or Roman Catholic priests. The geology is referred to as the Jesuits' science because it was the Jesuits who developed it, volcanology and all that. If you were to look at the moon, for example, a good majority of them, a good portion of them, are named after Jesuits who identified them through their telescopes. It was the Vatican Observatory that sent emissaries to Albert Einstein to show him that mathematically the Big Bang Theory was congruent with his unified, well, his theories. They showed it to him mathematically, and he was convinced to say, yes, you're right. And that was ideated by a French priest. You see, the thing that people don't understand, there's this misconception that the church is anti-science. It's absolutely false. That the church gave order to the universe. Now, you can't have scientific inquiry and science. It's got to be reproducible. If you're of the belief that everything is other motivated by the gods or whatever, there's no order. Everything is in chaos. Everything is a happenstance. It was the church that gave order to that. And giving order to the universe through natural law basically allowed the sciences to flourish.
I think we should be talking about the logic that the framers used. They used the logic that God put into motion. God put the universe into motion.
It was rationalism, exactly.
And we are standing on a playing field with boundaries and rules.
Right.
Delineated by God, not by man.
Exactly.
Those boundaries and rules are immutable. They cannot be changed.
They cannot be changed. They are not subject to change. And the interesting thing is that these theories go all the way back to 4th and 5th century before Christ in Greece. The sophists were very, very clear that man-made laws, which they called nomoi, that's the plural, nomos would be the singular, nomoi were customs or conventions that were subject to change with human input, whereas physis was nature, and nature was the guidelines of all of it. Cicero took this a little bit further and said that any written law by man, any nomoi, if you wanted to use the Greek word, had to be based in natural law, otherwise it was no law at all. It was just a capricious whim of the people at the time.
Well, Dr. Tom, what would you say to people who do not have a strong belief in God, or perhaps no belief at all?
Doesn't matter.
How do they fit into this equation? You're saying it doesn't matter.
No.
Why doesn't it matter?
Because even if you don't believe in God as the prime creator, as the prime mover, you have to acknowledge natural law. It's the underlying motivation for everything that goes on, whether it be cosmic or down to a microbial level, or even down to a genetic level.
Why can't I just make my laws up by myself, just like everybody else, and deal with my own ethical standards instead of...
You can, but then it'll create a horrible society. You know,
yes, everybody's ethics are different than everybody else's then.
Right. Now, you see, the interesting thing is that I saw this with bioethics, which is what they're trying to apply to the medical field. You see, ethics and morality are the daughters of faith in God, faith in the Creator. And when you take away the Creator, you got to base your faith and ethics in something. What are you going to base it in? You have to base it upon. Now, if you take away the pillar of where those concepts come from, ethics and ethical treatment would be to treat another the same way you would want to be treated. All right, that's ethical. A moral treatment would be not to harm somebody or to deprive them of their natural rights. All right, that's the basis of morality. So even if you don't believe in God, let's say, for example, you're an atheist. All right, and we say, okay, you have a right to life, you have a right to liberty, you have a right to free expression. Do you think that an atheist would not object if those things were taken from him against his will?
I think they would object.
Of course they would. Any rational person would object. Now, whether you can prove or not prove or disprove the existence of God, it's really a moot point. You are endowed by these things simply based upon the fact that you are part of nature. that you're the result of, let's say, 13.5 billion years of evolution from the Big Bang, or 4.5 billion years from the creation of the planet. Just the fact that you are a product, a byproduct, or a product of that process gives you your humanity. So whether you believe in the prime mover or not, it doesn't really matter.
You're talking about natural law now.
Yes. Natural law is the proof that there was some agency behind the creation of everything.
And from that, we get natural rights.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
some people get confused, as I did when I first learned about these concepts, about the difference between negative rights and positive rights.
Right.
How negative rights sounds like a bad thing.
Oh,
The reverse is true for those who don't understand it.
it's very bad. It's very bad for people who would like to convince you that you have no rights. Now, the reason it's called a negative right is because in order for me to express that right, all you have to do is leave me alone, is abstain from stopping me. So, it's not something that, there are several of the, all of our rights are based on that. When you're talking about positive rights, you're talking about a privilege or an entitlement that is consented to you by an acknowledged higher authority. That's not a right. That's a privilege. Sometimes you have to buy it. Sometimes you have to pay a fee. Sometimes you have to be a member of the club. The thing is that it would be very, very convenient for anybody that is seeking power in a government, using the government as a strong arm, to take away your rights and convert them into privileges.
And your father was very adamant that this was a direction that we were headed, and he didn't like it much.
No, he didn't. He didn't. Look, the American experiment is a thorn in the side of one of the most dangerous and deadly views that there are out there. And that is that you are an animal, you're a piece of meat with no rights. When you talk, I was listening to a discussion today about the roles of the Russians, the Americans, and the British in the Second World War. And they asked who won the war and who lost the war. And it was very interesting, the point of view of these people. America, if you were to say, economically and a position in world power and everything, America won the war. There's no question. If you were to use those same criteria to look at Great Britain, they lost. They lost everything. They lost their empire. They spent more than a third of their treasure trying to defeat the Nazis, the National Socialists, put it that way, because people seem to want to back away from calling Hitler a socialist. He was a socialist. It's not national that is the problem with the National Socialists. It's socialism that is the problem. All right, now, if you look at the Russians, they lost, I believe, 27 million soldiers died in that, fighting the Nazis. 4 out of 5 Germans that were killed in that war were killed by Russians. But you see, with Stalin, if he needed a couple of million people, he would just grab them off the earth, just grab them. He had a resource, grab them and throw them into the war. Some of them even went in without weapons, just to keep plugging at the Germans. He didn't care how much he lost. Why? Because he was a despot.
What's the point that, as it relates to the book there, Tom?
The point is that these people had no rights. They were chattel. That's what communism and socialism gives us.
You're a part of the larger body politic. You are a group, or you're not treated as an individual. Am I correct?
No, you have no individuality, and you have no rights.
You have a
Those
function.
rights are they're privileges. You have
A function.
You know, you have the privilege to die for the motherland. You know, Stalin didn't care. He was a butcher. The same thing with Mao Zedong. He was a butcher.
You know, you brought up an interesting point. Who won the war? We won it economically. We won it militarily. But I'm not so sure that we won it ideologically. In other words, socialism should have died when the horrors of the Holocaust and the degradation that took place during that war in the various societies that we were up against.
Yeah, horrible war.
It was horrible, and that ideology should have gone into the dustbin, but it hasn't. It's experiencing what I would guess is a resurgence. Why is that, and how do we stop it?
That's a good question. The fact of the matter is that people don't study their history. And they seem to believe that history didn't exist before they were born. You know, we have a lot of people, they didn't know what the Second World War meant. They didn't know what the Cold War was. You know, 80% of the people who died in that war were civilians. They were non-combatants. They were butchered by both sides, the Russians, the Germans. You know, the only people that brought a sense towards civilians in that war were the British and the Americans, the Allies, let's put it that way.
Well, you know, some would argue, Tom, against that. I mean, we had the bombing of Dresden, we had Hiroshima, Nagasaki. You know, Absolutely. There was a lot of collateral damage done there, and they could point to that and say, hey, were the Americans any better when it came down to...
Well, yes, there's no question that these were horrible acts. There's no question. But they were reprisals. They were not aggressive. They were reactive. You have to understand that it was the Allies didn't start bombing civilians. It was the people that were attacked afterwards in retaliation for bombing London, or, you know, firebombing London. The air supremacy was gone in Germany. They had an open day and a field day. As far as Japan goes, Japan's soldiers were the brutalest soldiers in that war. They were absolutely brutal. They killed millions of Chinese from 1936-37 on. Right? Now, when we talk about the dropping of the bomb, my father happens to have been one of the men who built the airstrip on the island of Tinian. He was in the 39th USNCB.
He was a CB. He watched the plane take off.
He watched the Enola Gay take off from Tinian. He didn't know what it was about. My Uncle Nick was in the air when that bomb was dropped. He was a fighter pilot in the South Pacific. He saw the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima. He was flying fighter escort, you know. He was in a P-38 and he was flying fighter escort with his wing. And they actually saw it. Now, I asked my father about this, and he said to me, Tom, the Japanese, we had seen how they fought on Iwo Jima. We saw how they fought.
They fought to the death, to the last man.
They were going to fight to the death.
To the last man.
To the very last man and to the last civilian.
They took out as many as they could, and they were ready to die.
Absolutely.
And they knew that were we to attack the mainland, we would have the same resistance.
Absolutely. And the thing is that we didn't need the atomic bomb. You know, they had no air supremacy. The war in Europe was over. You know, they had already knocked out 60% of the Japanese industry with conventional bombing. We didn't need to drop the atomic bomb. But the fact of the matter is that my father told me something very interesting. He said, yeah, it was horrible. But we didn't start the war. They did. this was not an aggressive act on our part. It was a defensive act. And on top of it, he said that we got word that we were gearing up. He was on the island of Saipan at the time with the 2nd Marine Division as a CB. They were gearing up because it was everything was secret. They were gearing up for the invasion of Japan, of the major islands. And they were told that they were estimating that 1.5 million Allied troops, mostly American, were going to die. Okay? And that approximately 4 million Japanese were going to die. That's what they estimated. Now, we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. I believe that 150,000 Japanese died in those bombs, with those bombs. Now, you have to think of the 1 million American or Allied lives saved and the 4 million Japanese lives that were saved by ending the war, and all of the generations that came after them. You know, war is horrible. There's no question about it. And it's always people with desires to control others that start wars. And you talk about unalienability of our rights. What gives these people in charge of a centralized government the right to impose their will on their neighbors? What gives them the right to think that they could come in and take over your territory and take your resources, you know, and you're going to sit there and take it? People have a sense of unalienability.
Well, now, Tom, I'll play the devil's advocate. People would say that in America we took over the land of the Indians, the indigenous people, much the same way that it happens all over the world, and that we owe those people their land back and a certain measure of treasure. What do you say to that?
Well, I think if anybody in our country is deserving of recompense for what happened to them, it would be the indigenous Americans. There's no question. But this was a practice all over the world. You know, we consider ourselves enlightened in the 21st century, but you're talking about things that occurred, you know, 300-400 years ago in the United States, and up until the 1870s, 1880s, you know, with the pushing of the Aboriginal, you know, the indigenous Americans into camps and things. But you know, if you were to look at a map and look at all of the Indian reservations in the United States, being a nation within a nation, you may be very well surprised to see how much land they actually have. I've seen maps of overlays of Indian reservations, Indian territories and things like that, and it is surprisingly large. In every state, I believe there are, you know, even in New Jersey, we have Indian reservations.
So wrapping up, I guess I would ask you, could you summarize Buster's views for us in a couple of sentences, and then we'll end the conversation?
His views were very, very concise. He believed that human interaction should be voluntary for the mutual benefit of each person involved. In other words, we should come to agreements that mutually benefits each of us. He was completely against coercive activities, forcing someone's will upon someone else, and as a consequence, he was completely against the concept of a government having rights. What we would like to see, and what we would like to see continue, is the recognition that each individual person is their own minority, and each individual person has rights that were not granted to them by some authority on high. It's the only way that we will eventually have peace. It's the only way that we will eventually have a brotherhood of man. Just basing it upon that. You can believe politically anything you want to believe, as long as the underlying, let's say, relief valve is a belief that people are individuals, that they have individual rights that were granted by God that cannot be transferred or sold, okay? And among them are natural rights, personal rights, civil rights, and political rights.
Hence the book and the title of the book, UnaLIENable.
Exactly.
Pick it up on Amazon. We will see you next time, Dr. Tom. And thanks for being with us.
Thank you.